We're tracking the diplomatic fallout from that exchange between Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and China's Xi Jinping at the G20 meeting. Two leaders are now taking part in the APEC summit. But right now, the focus remains on what they said to each other yesterday on the sidelines of the G20. Here's another look.
Everything we discuss is then leaked to the paper. That's not appropriate. And that's not how the way the conversation was conducted. There is sincerity on your part.
Free and open and frank dialogue, and that is what we will continue to have. We will continue to look to work constructively together, but there will be things we will disagree on.
Now, we're now learning that Xi's translator didn't interpret everything that Xi said to Trudeau. According to a translation by the Canadian press, Xi also said this to the Prime Minister, quote, "We should have conversations in a respectful way, otherwise the result can't be predicted." Now, there are questions over just what Xi meant. Some are interpreting those words as a veiled threat. Well, for more on this, we've reached Charles Burton. Now, he's a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and a former Canadian diplomat in China, and he joins us from Ottawa. Charles, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Good to speak with you.
The Chinese president expressed his displeasure with Prime Minister Trudeau in terms of the G20 conversation that appears to have been leaked. What was your reaction?
Well, I mean, I think that the Chinese president may have had a point that what occurred was a sort of casual 10-minute chat in a crowded room. It wasn't a formal bilateral, our prime minister gets 10 minutes in a crowded room, Mr. Biden gets 3.5 hours in a conference room, and the Australian prime minister gets a proper bilateral. But, and also he said that Mr. Trudeau's staff had misrepresented what they'd said to the media. That may or may not be true. But I think what really was the outstanding feature of it was the kind of Chinese language that he used. Having been educated in China, I'm pretty familiar with how people speak to each other, and this was not the kind of language that you would expect from a head of state to a Canadian prime minister. He certainly wouldn't talk like that to the U.S. president. It was disdainful. It was suggesting that Canada really doesn't matter to Mr. Xi and that we should get into line with them. And the way that the menacing threat was put at the end really had a certain sort of wolf warrior diplomacy menacing tone to it that I think suggests that we're not going to be having sort of stable civil relations with China under Mr. Xi. The idea that, maybe we could establish some ground rules and collaborate with China on climate change or health policy and still maintain our trade relations after the new Indo-Pacific policy comes through is not at all likely. And that threat may, in fact, work out when the policy is announced so that China can send a signal to other countries that if you adopt policies that inhibit China's espionage and harassment activities and global expansion, that there will be consequences. So I think we're in for rough days ahead, and I hope the Prime Minister will be ready for that. He clearly wasn't ready for this interaction that occurred yesterday.
A lot to unpack there. China still Canada's second largest trading partner, to be sure, and Canada, a country that has prided itself traditionally on being a middle power. So if we are now potentially being used as maybe an example, what does that say about Canada's place internationally, potentially?
Well, you remember back in 2017, the last time that Mr. Trudeau went to China, he wanted to get a free trade agreement going and wanted to add various riders like labor rights and women's rights to the agreement. And at the time he said, well, this is China's first free trade agreement with a G7 country, and felt that China would be able to consider the importance of appeasing Canada's requirement that the trade agreement have some social riders in it. And he was very badly blanked, and his press conference with the Chinese Premier of the State Council, Li Keqiang, was canceled. So that should send out a signal that the idea that Canada is an important, respected player in global affairs is probably a notion past its best due date. And China clearly has disdain for our Prime Minister and certainly doesn't think that, playing nice with Canada is something that China needs to do anymore.
So that brings us then arguably to the Indo-Pacific strategy. It's going to be released in a matter of weeks. Does this mean that Canada should press even more for growing business relations with Indonesia, Vietnam, other arguably potential rivals for China in the region and rivals for trade and investment?
Oh, absolutely. But of course, we should always be trying to expand our trade relations with the world, and not really entirely about China. But I think there's a certain urgency there if we are thinking that we need to secure supply chains with China, because China may seek to exert economic coercion on Canada if we start to crack down on non-economic issues such as China's espionage and harassment activities, the police stations, the illegal funding of candidates for parliament that they favor, placing their own people into parliamentary offices, all of which CSIS has recently reported to the government. So I think from that point of view, China will try and make Canada pay for this economically, and therefore it stands to reason we should diversify. I would say, though, that most of our exports to China are agricultural commodities and minerals. It only amounts to about 4% of our external commodities trade, and there is market for this stuff around the world, and I think we should be seeking out those alternative markets to reduce the possibility of economic disruption to Canada and allow us to continue to build our prosperity on trade and investment, but maybe not so much with China, but with other emerging economies that would provide a great space for Canada to do business.
So let's talk about then moving forward. What are you going to be watching for? Are the rest of the West going to stand by and let this happen, or should Canada seize this opportunity and really maybe break some ground, having had that China door much harder to open?
Well, I mean, Secretary of State Blinken was in Ottawa last month, and after he had his visit, we announced that we'd have a strategic dialogue on the Asia-Pacific with the U.S., and we requested that the U.S. reconsider their decision to deny Canada entry into the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity Economic Consortium, which there were 14 countries and Canada wasn't one of them. And I think maybe the U.S. is making it clear to Canada that if we try and play both sides of the street and talk a hard line on China without participating in the policy measures necessary to try and bring China into better compliance with the international rules-based order in trade and diplomacy, that will affect our alliance with the U.S. and could threaten our Five Eyes intelligence sharing. I mean, when the U.S. set up a security, trilateral security group in the Indo-Pacific with Australia, UK, and the US, and no Canada, that was certainly sending out a signal that the US didn't feel that Canada was a reliable partner in this. And, they chose UK instead. But last time I looked at the map, the UK is not an Indo-Pacific country, whereas Canada is.
A lot to watch for there. Thank you for your time and helping us understand it a little better. Appreciate it.
Great to speak with you.
Absolutely. Well, Charles Burton is a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and a former Canadian diplomat to China. He joined us from Ottawa.